Hello, hello, you guys. Welcome back to the podcast and welcome, Lindsay. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yes. Hi, Eden.
For those that don't know you yet, would you mind giving us a little introduction on yourself?
My name is Lindsay Bryan-Podvin. I'm a financial therapist. That means I have my background in clinical social work and I specialize in the emotional, psychological, and systemic side of money. I have a clinical practice and I also do a lot of financial well-being education via different workshops and facilitation. And I split my time between those two main roles at my financial wellness business, Mind Money Balance.
Wait, we love. Okay, so you started more on like the social work therapy side of things. When did the money journey start? Talk to me about like where that passion came from.
Yeah, the money journey started pretty much right away. To be clear, when I went to my MSW program, which is a master's in social work program, I was specializing in interpersonal practice and mental health. So I thought I was going to go be a therapist. And really quickly, in my first job with my master's degree, I got my paycheck and I was earning less than I was as a waitress. And for any listener out there, you know what it feels like to be living paycheck to paycheck. You might be in that at this moment in time. You might be experiencing financial uncertainty. And I know that listeners can understand that it isn't just the financial anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck. It's all the emotional, psychological, and physical signs and symptoms that came along with it that really threw me for a loop, right? So I'm very open that I have very well managed depression and anxiety. And all of a sudden, those symptoms started to flare. I developed chronic insomnia, which I never had before. And all of my previous coping skills and routine just didn't seem to be working
Mm.
anymore. And I did what any good Virgo does. I went to the library and checked out books and books and books about personal finance. And there's a little bit of good information in them, but mostly they were telling me it was my fault. Like I was undisciplined and drove too fancy of a car, and I didn't know how to say no to my friends, and I was having too much time at bottomless brunches, right? It was a lot of shame-based, individualistic take on things. And as
Mhm.
a social worker and mental health therapist, it just didn't sit right. So that was in 2012. And it just kind of kept sticking with me that like there was something icky here when it came to money. And then professionally, when I was working with my clients, as you can imagine, a lot of people have money stuff that comes up. And my job as a social worker, my training really said like help them find resources. So it was
Mm.
very much revolving around here's how to make sure your power doesn't get turned off, or here's a place to get supplemental food and go to a free food bank, which is incredibly important, but it did not address what happens next. How do we move forward through this? How do we move on? And I didn't want to be a financial planner. I didn't want to be a financial advisor. I really wanted to stay in my lane as a mental health therapist. And so over the years, I would just have these moments where I would like do a deep dive into Google and be like, how can I do social work and money, social work plus
Mm.
finances, therapy plus money, and eventually found my way to the Center for Financial Social Work and the Financial Therapy Association, got certified in both of those things. Then, fast forward to 2020, I made that my full-time job.
Oh my God. Okay, so you went full time in 2020. When in 2020?
So, backing up between 2012 and 2020, I bounced around to a few different social work jobs, which is super common in any industry, but
Mhm.
especially in social work, where you're on a limited license for 2 years before you can become fully licensed. So, I went from one nonprofit to another large nonprofit, and then I joined a group therapy practice. So, for anyone out there who is a therapist or who has gone to a therapist, oftentimes you'll find these group practices where you call one number or you email one person and they have like 10, 12 therapists on staff and they say, hey, Eden, let me match you with the best person for this particular set of concerns. So I joined a group practice in 2017 and it gave me a taste of working for myself. And it also gave me exposure to the types of clients that I'm best suited for and what it feels like to say yes to certain people and to say no to certain people.
Mhm.
And in 2017, it may have been 2018. Now my timeline's all confused, but at
I
any
have
rate,
no concept of
I
time
know,
after
right?
2020.
Sometime between 2017 and 2020, I got my my certificates in financial therapy and in financial social work. And I started tracking where my referrals were coming from. And I noticed that a lot of my referrals, because there are so few financial therapists, they were coming to me from other places. I'm based in Michigan, but people would be coming to me. For those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of Michigan, we have two peninsulas. So we have an upper peninsula and a lower peninsula. People would be coming to me from different peninsulas, and instead of driving, we would do telehealth. And I started tracking where my referrals were coming from, and my referrals were starting to come directly to me versus through the agency. And it kind of clicked for me that about 30% of my referrals are telehealth. I'm starting to shift into bringing in my own referrals. And so it became a financial decision to move into my own private practice. And it just so happened to line up with the start of the pandemic. And it also, it's awful to say, but in many ways, my private practice was prepared a little bit better because I'd already been doing telehealth. I'd already been seeing people via video. And so I had a level of comfort doing teletherapy that a lot of clinicians just weren't ready for. And money worries were right at the top of a lot of people's minds, obviously right behind things like their literal health and education. So that's kind of how I got to 2020.
Oh my gosh, I feel like that must have just like thrown you in the deep end. Like that was such a crazy financial time. Like even as a business coach, it was so untrue. I know we've heard the word 10 million times in terms of 2020, but like unprecedented. Like it was like, I don't know what's going on. Like I don't know what's going to happen. Like we've never experienced anything like this. Like what did kind of the journey with your clients look like at that time? Because it was obviously such a insane situation. Like what a crazy time to go full time.
I know. So there are a few things that happened. One was just being really transparent with them that this was also the first pandemic that I'd gone through, and I didn't have any sort of crystal ball or a past life that I could pull on and be like, well, the last time this happened with like the Great Spanish Flu in 1919, here's how it went. I had to roll with them a little bit more. And when I say roll with them, I mean that in a lot of traditional therapy, the rule, the guideline is to be a blank slate, to just be this person who echoes and reflects and repeats back what you're hearing and really letting the client take the lead on that, which there is a lot of value in. But you and I are on video. You can see that I am femme, I am female, I am mixed race, I look a little bit younger. Like there are so many things that don't allow me to be this stereotypical blank slate. So I already knew what it was like to show up in therapy rooms and not be able to conform to this therapeutic ideology that had been dominant. So I think leaning into who I am without making it like a therapy session about me. Obviously, I always maintained therapeutic boundaries and barriers, but just normalizing that I was in it with them and we were going to figure it out together. And that, of course, it was scary. And of course, it was nerve-wracking, and always coming back to what are the things that you have control over? What are the things that you can enact change around? And sometimes it would be as simple as, you know what, the only thing I have control over is making sure that my coffee's brewed in the morning. Great. Taking an action like that. When it came to finances, it might be doing something like turning on autosave so that anytime I'm paid, I'm putting a little bit of extra money into an emergency fund because maybe I was in a really stable job and now we don't know up from down and I want to bulk up a little bit more financially speaking. So giving people this both and, yes, we're in a scary time, and also what are the small things that you have control over? And when we are able to enact these tiny acts of control, it feels pretty good.
That makes sense. Yeah. Is that kind of like a commonality that you see with people when they're starting their money journey, is just like this wanting this feeling of control or feeling out of control?
Yeah, absolutely. And moving into like what I see in my practice and what I see in my workshops, what happens so often in the financial literacy space is that it's very prescriptive. Do this, then that will happen. If this, then that. But it doesn't really take into consideration an individual's individual lived experience.
Mhm.
And so a lot of folks will come in and be like, well, I tried to follow these 5 steps from this finance expert, but it just didn't work for me. And they internalize it as being like they somehow failed or they didn't get it right or they were wrong. And it turns them off from trying to take a more open-hearted or curious or holistic approach, something that's
Mhm.
much more realistic. And I find that with my clients, they kind of vacillate on kind of two sides of the same coin. And the way that that usually looks is like avoidance or perfectionism. And they're kind of two
Mhm.
sides of the same coin. Like, oh, I don't understand this financial term. It makes me feel really gross and uncertain that I don't know what it is and kind of embarrassed. So I'll just put my head in the sand. I won't file my taxes until the day that they are due. I won't look at whether or not that client paid that invoice until my accountant is telling me you're at like net 90 now. They are 60 days overdue. It is
Mhm.
time. Or we have the other hand, which is I will move towards perfectionism. Perfectionism is an attempt to control discomfort. And so they want to get it right. They want to read all the
Mhm.
books, listen to all the podcasts, consume all of the business coaching content, but they are so scared to make a mistake that they're kind of stuck in this perpetual learning
Mhm.
state without actually taking action. So a lot of my clients kind of swing between those two sides of the same coin.
That totally makes sense. I'm like, yeah, and both are attempts at control, which I can totally relate to. Can we walk through like each of them and kind of where you start with those types of clients and people in order to like start improving their money mindset, beliefs, and journey? Like, let's say we're going like full avoidance mode. Like, where do you start?
Yeah, with full avoidance mode, I often, well, let me back up. So for both of them, I think it's important to acknowledge just some of the basics about financial psychology that research shows that by the time we're about 7 or 8 years old, we have more or less decided what we think money is. Whether we think it's something that makes people fight, whether we think it's good, whether we think it's the root of all evil, we have made a decision about what we think it is. So if we roll back to what was happening in early childhood, what were the explicit, implicit, messages that we were getting around money? How did your parents or caregivers talk about it? What type of neighborhood did you grow up in? What were some of the lessons that you learned? So then moving forward to somebody who is avoiding money, I often try and figure out how that behavior is helping them. Rather than saying stop avoiding and just log into your bank account, that's really scary if we've been avoiding our money. I like to ask folks, how does not looking at it protect you? Right? In some way, shape, or form, we all do behaviors that may be quote unquote maladaptive or less than optimal because they work. So,
Mhm.
what does avoiding money do for you? How is it positively impacting you? And for a lot of folks, it prevents them and protects them from seeing this like worst case scenario. Well, if I don't see that my bank account is, in the red, then I don't have to face that reality. Or if I don't have to file my taxes on time, then I don't have to deal with looking at all these terms and these forms and these boxes that stress me out, right? Avoiding is a protective mechanism because you don't have to
Mhm.
face something. But the problem with avoidance is the more you put something off, the bigger that beast becomes. So it's a great temporary coping skill, but it's not a great long term coping skill. So I often try to figure out what a particular person's reason for wanting to avoid money is, and then lovingly and compassionately see if there's a way in to getting toward that bigger financial action. So if somebody is afraid, for example, of filing taxes, my go to wouldn't be, okay, let's go file your taxes right now. It might be thinking about, what are some other financial terms that were scary for you, but you figured out?
Mhm.
Or, what are some ways where you do interact with money and it doesn't give you the ick? And it could be something like, well, I buy my groceries every week and I actually feel okay when I tap my phone to pay. Or, as anxious as I get about taxes, I'm really good about invoicing my clients within 7 days of providing services. What are the things that they're good at, and trying to figure out what are the skills they use to do that behavior, and how can we translate some of those skills to the big scary financial behavior?
Mm. What are some of like those skills that you see, like the skills that you're transferring?
Yeah, it just depends on the person. But in this example, it might be um, somebody, if somebody were saying that, oh, yeah, well, I always invoice my clients or I always just pay for my groceries, I might ask them, well, like, how did you manage to do that? And oftentimes they'll be like, I don't know, I just do. And I'm like,
Hmm.
well, you don't just do it. Yes, now it's habitual, now it's a habit, but somewhere, some way, you learned that skill. You learned that when you tap to pay, you somehow know and have created a system for yourself that you have enough cash available if it's like connected to a debit card or a checking account. What were the skills that you had to do to get there? When it comes to invoicing clients on time, how did you move through that discomfort? Well, I figured out and I kind of learned the hard way that I put off invoicing people because I thought they would just pay me when they were ready. And at the end of the year, I had to chase a bunch of people down. And I really learned that chasing people down is far more uncomfortable than just sending the invoice right away. And so
Hmm.
we start to see, okay, so what I'm hearing now is that even though it's a little bit scary for this person, having a system or having automation seems to work. And then we'd go into what systems, what automations could we do for this other big financial scary thing that might work for you?
Oh, amazing. Okay, what about the people that are hyperfixating? I'm both of these people in different areas. I'm
Yeah, of
like,
course.
some things I'm like, we're just not even gonna look at that. And then some things I dive right in. And I'm sure you see it a lot. I feel like when you cope with things by trying to know everything, you get into a really like perfectionist mindset where at least for me, it's like really hard to take action because I'm like, I'm gonna do it wrong, or like there's just a lot of fear surrounding my actions. Where do you start with those people?
I love that you named some of the big feelings that come up with perfectionism because it's not as much about being right or as it is about being scared.
Mm,
Oftentimes with perfectionism, when it comes to financial perfectionism, it's masking anxiety. What if I make a mistake? What if I check a box and it messes things up? What if I do something and then I learn later that I did the wrong thing? And this overconsumption of information, like you said, becomes a burden in and of itself. So I like to play with an idea of enoughness. What is the amount of information that I need to have enough information to make a good decision? And
mm,
oftentimes with my perfectionistic clients, I invite them to pick a number below 100%.
mm,
Meaning, I need to have 100% of the information available before I open up a savings account. Well, that is going to take a long time to research every single fintech app, bank, credit union, and cross reference all of the numbers before you pick out a savings account. Maybe you say, I'm going to feel 80% comfortable with three local credit unions before I open one up. So, giving
mm,
themselves like a comfortable enough number can be a good way to move forward. And the other thing is getting comfortable tolerating making mistakes,
mm,
especially for women and folks who are socialized as women. There is this fear around not being able to bounce back from a mistake because, in so much of society, we do shame women if they make a mistake or if they mess up. And especially when it comes to money, we really aren't great about helping folks kind of come back from financial mistakes, right? Going back to my initial experience of reading personal finance books, it was very shame heavy. If you have debt, it's your fault and you don't know how to do math. If you don't have an emergency fund, it's because you have no willpower. So giving folks permission to make mistakes and normalizing that mistakes will continue to happen, which can be terrifying as a perfectionist. So sometimes I like to give them a precursor step to that, which is, what if we treated this like an experiment?
mm,
Instead of choosing the exact right thing, we go back to our fifth grade mind of doing a science experiment and creating a hypothesis and saying, you know what? I'm gonna test this out and see how it feels for a month, and then I can go in and I can tweak this behavior.
mm.
Um, and giving people permission to experiment instead of to feel like they have to make a choice that is irreversible is also quite freeing.
How do you start the process of being okay with like experimenting with money? Because I think like even that phrase sounds so scary because it's like, okay, what if I just lose it? Like how do you decide how much money to experiment, in what ways? Like how do you kind of overcome just like the initial almost like shock factor of the statement, like experiment with money?
Great question. So first, I would say that an experiment is not the same thing as gambling. And I could hear it in your
Mm,
voice like, well, if I experiment, then I'm going to blow all my money on something and never get it again. Let's be really cautious about when our mind jumps to that worst case scenario, which again is like, that's okay that your brain does that. Our brain is
mhm,
hardwired to scan the horizon for danger. So it's always going to pick up on those like
mhm,
scary things. That's a protective mechanism. But giving ourselves an on ramp to experimenting with money. For example, a lot of people feel guilty about treating themselves, right?
mhm,
They feel guilty about buying the latte. They feel guilty about buying a second lip gloss. They feel guilty about all this stuff. So sometimes an experiment might be take $20 on the first of the month, put it in your literal wallet, like actual cash,
mhm,
and give yourself permission to spend that $20 by the end of the week or by the end of the month on something that feels a little frivolous, like
mhm,
something that is somewhat low stakes, but also gives you permission to play with an experiment. If somebody is avoiding looking at their bank account, an experiment for them wouldn't probably be, well, let's take all of your accounts and aggregate them into one place and create like this monster spreadsheet. No, the experiment might be like, just open up your banking app once a day,
mm,
look at it for 30 seconds and then close it and just notice what it feels like. Like these can be the types of experiments that we can give ourselves. They don't have to be so grandiose. And the reason for that is it creates this positive momentum loop where when we start checking our account or when we start seeing that we can be trusted to spend
mm,
$20 on lip gloss and coffee and it won't like turn on a spigot that we can never turn off, it starts to build that self-trust muscle that is
mm,
often missing when we start taking ownership of our relationship with money.
mm. I love that. I think that's incredible. And also, yeah, it's like $20 is like you're very likely spending that on a couple cups of coffee. Like
Mhm.
that's something very doable to set aside. I'm curious because we haven't talked to anyone about this, and it's something that's been on my mind a lot. So I'm sure it has for other people as well. Um, what your thoughts are when it comes to almost like recession anxiety. Like, obviously, there's a lot of dialogue right now about that being a possibility, like a lot of discussion. How do you navigate that? How do you walk the line of like researching and educating yourself while not over researching and stressing yourself out? Like, how are you advising people plan? Like, what are kind of your thoughts around that?
This is a really important question because most of our financial decisions are emotionally based. And when we're anxious, when we're stressed, when we're driven by fear, we are less likely to make financial decisions that end up being safe in the long run.
Hmm.
So it makes perfect sense that folks are experiencing some anticipation around a recession and wanting to plan accordingly. And I first just want to remind folks, if you haven't been through a recession before, welcome. I'm an elder millennial and I've been through one before, and we'll make it through another one too. But one thing is just to normalize what a recession is and help people understand that this happens in any economy. In
Mm,
economies, there are periods of growth and there are periods of what the language we use here is recession. And a recession simply means two consecutive quarters of economic loss or stock market loss, which sounds silly because it's recession's kind of like a vibes thing. Do you know what I mean?
literally.
Like,
Yeah.
we're right now, everyone's like, we're in a recession. I'm like, well, we can't literally say that for,
Hmm.
a little bit longer. But when it comes to threading the needle between being informed and not feeling like you're not allowed to leave your house, I think it is wise to get a financial foundation under you. So, first and foremost is a term that is used a lot, but I don't think a lot of people have maybe examined in a curious way, which is an emergency fund. An
Mm,
emergency fund is a savings account that is to be used by you in the event of an emergency. So an emergency, while you can kind of define it, is often something like losing your job or having a huge unexpected car repair. An emergency is not, oh my gosh, Sabrina Carpenter's going on tour again. I need to get my tickets out. It is actually impacting your financial well-being. And an emergency fund, experts will say like, oh, you need 6 to 8 months of expenses in an emergency fund, which means how much does it cost you to live every month? But specifically, how much does it cost you to have your basic needs met every month? So if you are just on your, I need to feed myself, I need to clothe myself, I need to make sure that my utilities are paid for, that I have access to medicine and healthcare, and if you have children, that you have the financial capacity to care for their well-being, what is that number? Because in the event of a true financial emergency, we probably wouldn't be spending $90 a month on a gym membership, even though for many of us, that is something that is integral to our mental health and physical well-being. In an emergency, we may have to pull back on that. So first is figuring out how much does it actually cost me to live each month? And having 1 month of expenses is a nice benchmark to have. Researchers in 2019 found it was around like $2,500. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking closer to $3,000 right now, which, to be fair, is a large number, but it's not as large as 6 to 8 months of expenses. That can feel really, really scary. And if you're listening and you're like, Lindsay, I have $20 in a savings account, there's no way I'm getting to $3,000. I would invite you to like take a deep breath and give yourself a first benchmark of $400 or $500. And the reason for that $400 or $500 is that's about the average cost of an unexpected expense. So like a car insurance deductible or getting a flat tire and needing to be towed, like that's the average cost. So we want to have at least that much money available. And as we are potentially heading into a recession, when it goes back, kind of threading the needle back to this idea of experimenting with things, can you experiment with spending a little less just until you are able to save up that $400 or $500? Notice how it feels. Notice what you missed. Notice what maybe you didn't miss at all. And then kind of tweak and play until you get to that 1 month of your expenses amount. So that is good advice, regardless of whether or not we're heading into a recession, but especially right now, that is something that I think everybody can take into account and really prioritize. Other things to prioritize and be mindful of without, losing your overall well-being. Make sure that like your resume is updated. Make sure, I know there's a lot of creative entrepreneurs listening. Make sure that your website is looking good and that people can see what services you provide. Reconnect to your network. It's really challenging to reach out to somebody who you haven't spoken to in a year or two and be like, hey, do you have a job? If you're worried about getting laid off, start nurturing those connections now. Attend some networking events now, but also be mindful of the emotional, financial, and literal support of actual community. I think in online spaces, we say things a lot like, oh, lean on your community, but we don't know what that actually means. It could literally mean make sure you know your neighbor well enough so that if you lose your job and need to go to a job interview, that they could come over and like dog sit for an hour, or, if you have a little kiddo at home, watch your kid for an hour, right?
Absolutely.
What are the community resources that we have access to that are not maybe dollars based, but they are relationship based? We cannot weather a financial storm or recession on our own. And this idea that, we can just save our way into having all of our needs met, I think is really unfair at best and also just not true. So nurturing your community, figure out what skills your friends, your loved ones have, think about other ways that you can swap time and energy with one another and support one another. Maybe you have a friend who's like amazing at thrifting. Maybe, go with them the next time they go thrifting. If you need to pick up like a new pair of pants or a new pair of shoes, maybe they can like teach you the tricks of the trade, right? If you have a friend who's really savvy at, making freezer meals for a week ahead. See if you can join them when they are like meal prepping for the week. These are things that are skills that we can give and receive in community that aren't necessarily tied to our bank account, but absolutely matter in the face of a recession and all times, obviously.
No, I'm obsessed with that. I think, yeah, I mean, that's like a whole nother conversation we could talk about for hours. I
I
love
know.
talking about community because I think it's something that we lost for obviously years during the pandemic and then kind of had like this overcorrection into community but in a really online way, and I think it's been really interesting to watch how people have adjusted to in real life spaces again. And I talk about it all the time with my friends, kind of this like over commoditized, I can never say this word, over commoditized, you get the gist, zation of taking care of ourselves, like to the point where there's a lot of conversations of like, oh, I'm going through a hard time, so I can't be there for you. And like, that's not what true community is. Like, community is showing up for people when it's hard and it's helping your friends and neighbors even when you're tired and vice versa. And so I think it's really important, yeah, for people to think about like, yes, what are these skills and networks and connections that you can receive from other people, but also like what can you bring to the table for them when they need help? Like what does that look like? I think it's a really beautiful, important concept that again we like lost access to for a while, which is so sad. And like it's been really interesting to see like how we've brought that back into our lives. And I think too, like when it comes to money, I've noticed that I got into a habit quite often of like trying to lower my expenses in a really obvious way, or like earn more money, when in reality, like you're saying, I'm like there are skills that you can trade people that then save you money. Or like I like totally off the cusp, but like I started doing more like content creation and now I like don't have to spend money on like restaurants as often, or going and doing fun activities because I do it in trade for content. And so it's like those are ways to save money in ways that feel a little less obvious. Like there's lots of ways to kind of navigate that. So I love all of that. Sorry, that was a rant, but obsessed with all of that.
No, all good. I love a good rant because to your point of community, that's also like what a conversation is. So I
Yeah.
love when they kind of twist and turn and we go somewhere new.
No, I'm obsessed. And I love too you said it at the beginning of your thought of like kind of setting a time limit on cutting back on your spending of like let me get to $500 and then I can like be a little bit more chill and relaxed in the way that I eat out, or like just an example. But I think it's really daunting when you're wanting to dive into budgeting to be like, am I cutting this thing that maybe brings me joy or ease out forever? And it's much easier to be like, let me get to this marker and then like we can reevaluate, and then we can get to another marker and reevaluate. Like it doesn't have to be this like, oh, money's tight, like let me never eat out again. Like that's not going to happen. And it's also going to be extremely stressful.
Yeah, and on top of the stress is the kind of self-judgment and shame that comes
Mhm.
up if we, you know, don't do the thing that we think we're supposed to do. So if we do say yes to going out with a friend for dinner while we're simultaneously saving up for an emergency fund, many of us get caught up in this idea of like, well, I'm just not good at saving. It's not good for
Mm.
me. I tried, I can't stick with it. What's the point? And we beat ourselves up versus you know what? I had a goal. I would have really loved to hit that $500 by XYZ date, but my friend really matters. And I was so honored to celebrate their birthday with them or even just like catch up with them or whatever the thing is. And those two things are not in opposition with one another. And I think that's the way a lot of budgeting looks at things
Mm.
instead of, we're temporarily pulling back or we're temporarily turning down the dial on something. It becomes this all or nothing, black or white, good or bad. And that just isn't sustainable.
Hmm. No, I completely agree. I'm like we feel so naturally called to put labels on things of like good or bad.
Yeah.
It's so unhelpful.
Hmm.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of this. This has been so helpful. As we like kind of wrap things up, if you could leave us with like one general piece of advice or like some of the best advice you've received when it comes to money, like what would that be?
Yeah, I think the wisdom that I leave with folks sounds a little counterintuitive, but I hinted at it earlier, and it's that as you learn about financial literacy and having a good relationship with money, expect mistakes to happen and trust that those are lessons along the way and they aren't indicative of your capacity to
Mm.
understand money or to have a healthy relationship with money. Money is something that impacts all of us, and it's incredibly important that we address it and we acknowledge it and we figure out how we want it to work for us in our lives.
Oh, I love that. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on and
Yeah.
sharing all of this. It was so lovely to meet you. We'll obviously link everything in the show notes, but can you tell us where we can find you online?
Yes, of course. So, as I mentioned at the top, my business is called Mind Money Balance. You can find me all over the internet at that handle. I am, on and off of social because it's like in and out of being good for my mental health, as I'm
Real.
sure many people resonate with. So, the most consistent place you can find me is actually on my newsletter. You can get it by going to mindmoneybalance.com/newsletter. Very easy to remember. And the other thing that folks can do is if they're like curious about kind of their money style or their money type, I have a free quiz that helps people learn about their unique strengths and challenges in terms of how they relate to money. And they can find that money archetype quiz at mindmoneybalance.com/quiz.
We love. Oh my gosh, we will link that all for you guys in the show notes that are listening. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and Lindsay, thank you so much again for coming on.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Thank you.